Thanks a lot, Kelsey. Great introduction for all of us, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I was joking just before we got started today that Friday is a good night after a snowstorm like we experience here for everybody to stay in and listen to a great and also participate in a conversation on this really, really important topic. I think the numbers tonight show that we're hitting the mark with something that's important to you guys. We do have 3 professional experts on the subject with us, but there's a number of experts, as I see, who are on this Zoom call who we want to hear their voices as well as we have this conversation after the presentation. So I really appreciate it. The people that we mentioned who will be presenting tonight include from the DNR, Eric Otto, he's a forest health specialist with the DNR. James Jacobs, he's with Forest Service. He's a plant pathologist, I believe. And we also have Mike Reichenbach, who's University of Minnesota Extension Educator. Many of you are very familiar with Mike and all his work that he's done for us on the North Shore. So I will not do a lot of speaking tonight. I will be listening and learning as much as I can from all of you, and hope to guide our forest collaborative work into the future when we're dealing with this important topic of white pine blister rust. So with that, what I'd like to do is ask Mike if he would provide a little context for all of us here viewing tonight about what we might want to be thinking about as the presentations are unfolding or as conversation starts to build throughout the evening. So thank you, Mike.
Okay, John. Excuse me. Thanks very much. It's good to be here tonight. And while we're listening to the presentation and thinking about planting white pine, and I think we'll be thinking a lot about what the care requirements are, how much time we spent caring for it, and what that means. But in addition to that, as you're thinking about that and learning about white pine blister rust, let's be thinking about kind of the bigger picture of, if we're out on our woods and we're planting trees and we're planting to go ahead and restore a component or species that used to be there. So if we're missing species, what trees do we have too many of? Because, where is the space coming from to plant these new trees and spend the time caring for them? I think the other thing is think about your own personal experiences with tree planting. What trees do you want? Obviously, you're interested in white pine, and just a little background. I started, when I came to Minnesota, I came from Oregon, and one of the first people I heard speak at a conference was Jack Ryla. And he wrote this book. I got it there at that conference, and he actually signed it. He's passed away now, but bringing back the white pine, it's one of my favorite trees. Think about, what are your favorite trees, and what have you tried to get your favorite trees to grow? What special techniques to care for them, and think about the time that you're going to be putting into that. I think finally, and this goes along with that, think about, what does the future hold for you and your property? What will you plant? How will you care for it? And what do you need to get that done? So I'll turn it back to you, John.
All right, great introduction there. Appreciate it. So with that, I think we're going to jump right into the presentations. I think James Jacobs will be starting us off with this presentation. Again, I mentioned he's with the Forest Service as a plant pathologist. So James, if you are, I don't see you on the screen. I think you are here, but if you would just go ahead and share, and I'll just step back. And I want to make sure that you are
Let me
not
go back
muted.
and mute myself. There we go.
There you go.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thanks, John. As John mentioned, I'm a plant pathologist with the USDA Forest Service. I work out of St. Paul, Minnesota. The office I work for is called Forest Health Protection. And so in our particular office, we cover 7 states in the upper Midwest. And so that includes Minnesota. And so we provide general forest health assistance to federal land managers, and we also have a cooperative program with the states, and Eric is part of that program, who you'll hear from next. And so we're here to talk about white pine blister rust. Some of the pictures on this screen are actually not from Minnesota, and that's to highlight something we'll talk a little bit more about later on in this short presentation, that white pine blister rust is not confined to the eastern United States. The picture that should be on the left-hand side of your screen is actually a southwestern white pine, and that was the first tree that white pine blister rust was found on in New Mexico. And so you can see a number of infections in that tree, and we'll talk a little bit about the signs and symptoms of this disease as we go on. But I just want to highlight the sheer number of infections on that tree, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later on. So I include this slide and a couple others in almost every talk I give about forest diseases. This particular disease, as we'll see in a minute, is not native to the United States. It was introduced here, but it has been around for quite a long time. And even though some diseases of forest trees may seem incredibly damaging, especially when you're looking at it from the perspective of your own woodlot or your own yard, they do have some benefits. And that includes white pine blister rust. And we might talk about a few of those things in a minute. Disease as a whole is a rare event. So not only is it rare for a microbe, in this case a fungus, to be a pathogen, but plants are bombarded throughout their lives by spores or other propagules of the microbes that are causing the disease. And in this particular case with white pine blister rust, in some case billions of spores can literally be hitting these trees, and you may only end up with a few infections here and there. And that's due to a number of factors, not only factors involved in the tree itself, whether that be resistance or whatever, but also weather factors and some other climatic issues that we might talk about a few of those things in a few slides. And I might add that needle on the right-hand side is actually an eastern white pine needle that has been infected by white pine blister rust. And you can see I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can folks see my cursor or no?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this little yellow spot here is actually, these 2 rows are the stomates, or the spots where trees breathe or transpiration occurs. And so as a spore lands on the needles, and we'll see a little bit in another couple of slides more about this, more detail, it grows and penetrates that needle. And this is the first actual sign of the disease, or symptom of the disease that occurs on trees, that little tiny yellow spot. So the pathogen we're talking about, white pine blister rust, it's a rust fungus named Crenartium rhibicola. And it's actually, the species name is rather fitting. The alternate hosts are currants and gooseberries, or plants in the genus Ribes. There's a couple of other hosts, but they're really not as important as the currants and gooseberries are to the disease cycle of this particular pathogen. It's lethal to all 5 needle pines, so the soft pines. In the eastern United States, obviously, we just have the one, eastern white pine, but this disease is lethal on all other white pines throughout the United States and the world. So western white pine, you may have the bristlecone pine species, both species in the west, as well as sugar pine along the west coast. It was, as I mentioned, introduced to the United States, both the eastern and west coasts around the early 20th century. And we'll see, I think I have a slide coming up that actually talks a little bit more about the introduction and spread. So this is the basic disease cycle of white pine blister rust. It's very complex, but as with most rust fungi, it's very elegant. And so here is what it looks like in the summertime on the main host, Ribes. This happens to be Ribes nigrum. And this has a lot of infection on the bottom of the leaves, which is not typical of the Ribes that you'd see in your woodlot or in your yard if you have any planted. This is a lot. We purposefully increase the infection on these leaves in order to inoculate pine seedlings to search for resistance. Now that spore stage that's on ribes actually produces something called a Uridinia spore. And not getting overly technical, but that spore stage builds up infection on the ribes leaves throughout the summer. And in the fall, those structures germinate, produce another type of spore, which produces another type of spore. And that spore is the infection spore that actually infects trees. And so as I mentioned, bring up my cursor here again. Here's 2 lines of stomates on the white pine needle, and the spore would land anywhere on these needles, germinate, and grow into the stomate and penetrate the stomate, where this is actually a micrograph and a light microscope where I have the fungus stained. So you can see this purple color here. This is actually the white pine blister rust fungus growing inside the needle where it's actually getting nutrients, beginning to get nutrients from the tree. A white pine blister rust is something we call an obligate biotroph. So all that means, it's a fancy way of saying it needs a living host to survive. And that actually dovetails into some of the treatment recommendations or things we can do to mitigate some of the damage that Eric's going to talk about in a minute. And so the only way that the fungus can get into the tree to cause these destructive cankers is through the needles. And so invariably, what you will have once the fungus grows down through the needle, down through the fascicle, which is just the bundle sheath that holds the needles onto a branch, goes into a branch. Invariably, you have a branch at the center of a white pine blister rust canker. You can still have on very young trees where there are primary needles growing from the main stem, there may not be a branch in the center of a canker, but it had to have come from a needle into the tree. And so you get that very characteristic diamond-shaped canker with in the spring, you get these orange ichthyospores, which that spore goes to ribes and starts the cycle all over again. So the spores that infect pine, they have a very, they're pretty delicate. And so they require weather conditions that are conducive to their development, which is the reason why we don't see hundreds and hundreds of cankers on every white pine around. Some years we don't get those conditions necessary for that to develop, which is essentially roughly 100% humidity over the course of 48 to 72 hours, very cool temperatures, and the spores need that to germinate and actually grow into the needle. So the disease does well where places where dew forms and some degree of moisture can persist on the needles. So this is just to highlight again, when I'm talking to landowners or folks that are struggling with this disease, sometimes you do get them thinking that disease can come from other sources, but in fact, it does have to germinate through the needles to produce cankers. Currants and gooseberries also are native currants and gooseberries that do grow in Minnesota and in parts of the Midwest. It's kind of it's odd. Those species were here already. And so it was a little bit fortuitous that they do tend to grow in areas with damp, moist sites, nutrient-rich soils. They're abundant around lake shores, wetlands, rich woodlands, also where we find white pine. And so the alternate host does tend to coexist in some areas. I was looking at where most of you are from. I'll show some risk maps in a minute. It just so happens that you're in high risk zones for white pine blister rust development. So how did we get here? I mentioned that white pine blister rust was an introduced disease. Now, many of you are familiar with some of the logging history in the eastern United States. And as we began cutting across the eastern US, white pine was being depleted, and white pine seed was actually shipped over to Europe to be grown. We didn't have a nursery industry in the United States. And so these white pine seedlings were growing in Europe, and they were getting a rust. It was initially thought that the rust was caused by a different disease, but by the mid 1800s, it was starting to mid to late 1800s. It was starting to propagate more on the eastern white pine that we're growing, and they actually found the disease on ribes and where it got its name, its species name of Ribicula. And so inoculations proved that Ribicula was causing the disease on eastern white pine in the late 1800s, and sadly, we had already been shipping seedlings back to the United States. So by the early 1900s, roughly 1906, it was introduced multiple times. The rust was introduced to the US. We began to see damage on our native pine, as well as mature pine in Europe. By 1950, the rust was well established throughout most of the range of eastern white pine, as well as the western white pine species. I think I mentioned at the outset the tree in New Mexico, which was present, where'd my cursor go? There it is. Right about here in that state. It wasn't introduced to New Mexico until 1990, roughly. And it wasn't found in Arizona until 2009. So although it had moved through the eastern US quite quickly throughout the entire growing region of eastern white pine and in the other western species, for some reason, it did not move very fast through this part of the United States. And that's probably due to disconnected populations of trees, which we don't have in the eastern US. It's a pretty contiguous path of eastern white pine from Maine all the way to Minnesota. Okay. And so as we began to observe this rust, it became clear that certain areas were certainly at higher risk of white pine blister rust. And over the course of the years that we've been working on this for, roughly 100 years, a little more than 100 years, various rust maps have been made with hazard zones put up, very early maps to more modern maps, which show areas where white pine blister rust is most likely to occur. And this map it's unfortunate in the upper left-hand corner. That map has these cross hatches, and they can be hard to see, and they probably are hard to see on some of your screens. But essentially along the lake shore here on the North Shore and on the South Shore in Wisconsin are high hazard zones for white pine blister rust. One of the first things that occurred with eastern white pine, and Eric's going to touch on this in a little bit, was a recognized resistance. Some trees just didn't seem to get white pine blister rust as much as others. And so a concerted effort was made to try and breed these trees, collect specimen trees that maybe showed some type of resistance. There's me in the upper picture, much younger, holding a tray of eastern white pine that we inoculated at the University of Minnesota to test for resistance. And so in the Lake States, the program really started in the 60s and 70s at the University of Wisconsin, as well as the University of Minnesota, and it had varying levels of success. And one of the things that came out of this is there is more robust resistance in some of the western white pines than there is in eastern white pine, sadly. We have a more well-developed breeding program for the western white pine, western species than we do in the east, although we still have somewhat fledgling eastern white pine breeding program in the eastern United States and Canada. Certainly the western species have had more work done. But we still do have some pine, naturally occurring pine throughout the upper Midwest that may do better than others. And so the reason I bring this up is sometimes as landowners, you can observe things where you're getting a lot of younger pine dying off and other trees seem to be doing just fine. And sometimes those things are just misses, or they're just skips where they're not actually catching the disease. And in other cases, they have some of these resistance mechanisms. Some of the trees in this tray that I'm holding, the original parent trees were collected near Duluth. And so some of these green trees, the original parent trees, were collected in Duluth, and all of these were inoculated with the disease. And so we have varying levels of resistance present throughout the upper Midwest in our eastern white pine. Just some fun facts towards the end here of my portion of the talk. Eric's going to talk about ribes eradication, and maybe some of you have heard about that in the past. In the United States, we spent roughly $150 million on rabies eradication. And this is not $150 million in rabies eradication 10 years ago. This was a long time ago. So we spent a lot of money working on white pine blister rust, not only with rabies eradication, but also just with other pieces of disease control. And Eric will touch on some of those. In 1919, the value of standing white pine was estimated to be more than $1 billion in 1919 dollars. And there is some discrepancy on whether that's just the East, West, or both. I happen to think it's probably just the East and Southeast with some of the more southern eastern white pine populations. By 1952, we had losses of roughly 90 million board feet of saw timber and 75 million board feet of pole and smaller trees. And in 1955, the U.S. Forest Service, who actually funded a significant amount of the disease control work on white pine blister rust, spent roughly $3.8 million on direct disease control. Of that $3.8 million, and that's for all diseases affecting trees in the United States, $3.6 million was spent on white pine blister rust. So it's been an expensive disease. The last thing I'll touch on, and I just have a few slides on this. We can certainly talk about this more in the discussion portion of this talk. Not all flagging on eastern white pine is caused by white pine blister rust. One of the things with that diamond-shaped, very characteristic canker on the main stem of eastern white pine, it does set it apart. And the more you look at some of these cankers on trees, you can visually separate them pretty easily. But this is the disease that we are seeing more damage on in the upper Midwest recently, like within the last couple of decades. And it's caused by a fungus called Caliciopsis. And so it's not new. We do think it is native, but we are seeing damage begin to increase. And we don't know why. It could be a number of factors. If you see here, it's kind of resinous bleeding from the center of the canker. I just took some water and kind of washed off the stem, and you can see the canker margin here in the outer bark. One of the other characteristics of Caliciopsis versus what we see in eastern white pine is that this particular canker pathogen does not come in through the needles. It comes in throughout some other type of wound. So you're not always going to have a branch in the center of the canker, although you still could. It's not going to have a needle fascicle in the center of the canker or anything like that. And whereas white pine blister rust had very showy fruiting bodies, that's what we call the spore stages or the parts of the fungus that we can actually see. In Caliciopsis, they look like eyelashes, or we've been calling them eyelashes, and they're very, very small. Here's very up close with an arrow showing these eyelashes sticking out from the stem, and a little farther away. You have to get quite close to the stem to be able to see this, but you can see the canker margin on the picture here. Where's my cursor? There it is. This brown edge here next to that showy characteristic green bark of a young eastern white pine. Here's just some more pictures of Caliciopsis. This flagging on this tree could look like white pine blister rust as you're driving down the road, but it was in fact caused by Caliciopsis canker, just killing little branchlets or small branches in the trees. You can see the canker surrounding these branch whorls here on some younger white pine. This is actually a dead gypsy moth caterpillar, but you can see another example of the fruiting bodies sticking out from that canker. This can be pretty destructive. We see it more on suppressed trees, so understory trees that are growing very slowly and stressed for other reasons. All of this flagging is caused by Caliciopsis canker. And as you scrape off that outer bark, all of these little tiny brown spots are individual cankers. And whereas white pine blister rust goes through all the way to the cambium, so the tissue where the tree is actually growing on the stem, occasionally Caliciopsis canker, and actually probably more than occasionally, more often than not, when I find Caliciopsis canker, it's quite shallow, can be somewhat phloem limited, so that outer food transport tissue on the tree. But you can see the individual cankers here after scraping off that outer bark. And that's all I had for the initial kind of introductory part of the presentation.
That's a great start for us here, James. I greatly appreciate it. Yeah.
Stop sharing.
Okay.
There.
So I think what we'll do is quickly pivot and work towards Eric's presentation here. Eric Otto again, DNR, Forest Health Specialist.
All right.
And
how's
there you
that?
go. Very
Can you
good.
see that? Okay. All right. Thanks, John. So I'm Eric Otto. I'm a forest health specialist. So I work in Northeast Minnesota, based out of Grand Rapids. Work on different insect and disease issues with DNR foresters, landowners, and other agencies. And so I'm going to go over some management recommendations for blister rust now that we have a good background provided by James. Let's see here. So James went over the life cycle and the biology of this disease, and he mentioned it requires cool, moist conditions for those spores to germinate and cause infection. So one of the main methods to do to really minimize blister rust damage is to prune white pine trees. So research has shown that greater than 99% of infections are occurring in that bottom 9 feet of a tree where you're getting those cool, moist conditions that accumulate. And here's a couple photos where you can see those symptomatic flagging branches that you could eliminate via pruning, which I'll go over into a little more detail here. So basically, you could start pruning as soon as trees are about 5 to 7 years old, 2 feet tall. And then after that, you could prune them anytime after that. And basically, you're going to prune off those lower branches of the tree. And you roughly want to use this method of where you're pruning the bottom third and leaving at least 2/3 of the live crown. Some publications say you could have about a 50-50 ratio where you're pruning the bottom half and leaving half of the live crown, but it's probably better to do leaving 2/3 just to, it's probably promoting better tree vigor, having more needles and photosynthetic capacity using this 2/3 and pruning that bottom third of the tree. And you can basically do this until you prune up to that 9 feet. As I mentioned, 99% of infections are occurring in that bottom third. But you could do this up to 17 feet, and that's generally more ideal. If you have a lot of white pine trees, that might not be practical, but if you have some around your landscape around your house, then that might be a good method to really eliminate blister rust. And when you're doing your pruning cuts, you want to do it just outside of what's called the branch collar. So this is where the branch and the main stem meet. It's kind of the shoulder or this bulge area where you have all those tissues accumulating from the main stem and the branch. And what you don't want to do is what's called a flush cut, where you cut through that branch collar. And also above here, this is called the branch bark ridge, which is kind of sticking up there. This is just going to lead to a bigger wound. It's not going to promote good wound wood formation. You'll probably have more issues with decay fungi. So what you want to do is prune. So don't do that. Prune just outside the branch collar. And this is going to promote better wound wood formation and let the tree do its thing to heal over that wound. And what tool you use to prune is dependent upon how thick the diameter of that branch is. So for those smaller trees, probably up to 1 inch in diameter, you can use hand pruning tools. So it's probably better to use a hand tool such as a bypass pruner that kind of functions like a scissors compared to an anvil pruner. But once those branches get bigger, you might have to use a lopper or hand saws. And if you're pruning a really big branch, you might have to do, it might be a little more complicated than this, where you're going to have to do additional cuts. Otherwise, if you just did one cut on a really big branch, you're going to risk tearing the tissue down here and exposing more of that main stem. And when to prune, you can basically do it any time of year, but it's best to do it during the dormant season. That's going to result in less sap and resin flow out of that wound. And you probably don't want to prune in the spring. That's when it's most likely you're going to have more injury to the bark. It's more susceptible during that time of year when the tree is getting out of dormancy. Here's just a couple examples of poor pruning. So in addition to flush cutting, something else that happens when people prune is where they leave the stub. This also isn't promoting good wound formation around that cut. You could also have issues with canker fungi when you're leaving these branch stubs. The photo on the right, this isn't too bad, but it is more of a stub. Here you have probably a poor angle of where that cut was made, and you can see if it's more of a flush cut. You had some tearing occur here too. So you could have issues with decay fungi or just poor wound formation around that pruning cut. So basically just prune to that branch collar. As you can see here is a good example of just outside of that branch collar, and then you have that branch bark ridge right there. And this is an example of those bypass pruners that kind of act like scissors and going to result in less tearing of that tissue. In addition to preventative pruning, you can also prune currently infected branches if you are doing pruning or you're scouting your white pine trees. But basically the rule of thumb is to prune it if that canker is beyond 4 inches from the main stem as shown here. So based on the rate of spread, that fungus hasn't made its way to the main bowl. So pruning this, you're going to eliminate the fungus. But if that canker is within 4 inches, it's probably not worthwhile pruning it. You still could, but it's probably not worth it to prune that branch because if the canker is this close, it's probably in that main stem and you're going to have a canker form in the main stem some years down the road. So probably not worthwhile to do that. And also based on the biology, as James went over, you don't have to sanitize your tools before each cut, as this doesn't spread from pine to pine. You need that alternate host, so currants and gooseberries. And along those lines, you don't have to properly dispose of those pruned branches. If you're pruning a lot of trees, you can leave them on site. That's not going to be a risk to those other pine trees in the area. Just important to note that pruning is very effective, but it's not going to save every tree. You can have infections occur anywhere. So the majority are occurring in the bottom 9 feet of a tree, but you can have some in the mid canopy, upper canopy, as shown in this photo. Also, when you're pruning, you might miss some infected branches, as it can take a year or two until you actually have symptoms from that canker that take form, and you might miss those when you're pruning. It's also important to point out, don't over prune, so use that 2/3 rule where you're leaving 2/3 of the canopy. So this obviously is an extreme example of overzealous pruning, where they pretty much pruned all the live branches off. In that case, that tree isn't going to bounce back. So overall, pruning up your white pine canopies, that's going to minimize blister rust risk. This photo is just demonstrating that more so. So even this example, you probably have more than 2/3, but you're pruning out those lower branches where all that cool, moist conditions are going to be conducive for blister rust infection. And if you're looking to plant white pine, James mentioned there's different resistance found in white pine. So there is one that's available in the Midwest for eastern white pine. It's called Patton Silver Splendor, named after Robert Patton from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, that did a lot of work of screening white pine trees for resistance against blister rust. And so one of the main resistance mechanisms of Patton Silver Splendor is that it has more of a thicker, waxy cuticle, and that basically just prevents germination and infection of those spores into the stomata of the needles. That those, as James showed in that photo, you have those lines of stomata on the underside of needles that allows for that gaseous exchange. So that's going to be less conducive for the fungus to cause infection. But you'd probably still, if you're planting these, you'd still want to prune them up, leaving 2/3 of that live crown. And if you're looking to plant currants or gooseberries, there are certain resistant varieties. This is from the University of Minnesota's Extension website. I can put this link in the chat, but just showing there are quite a different varieties of red and white currants, black currants, gooseberries. And currently in Minnesota, there aren't any restrictions on planting currants. I know in Michigan, you do need a permit to plant black currants, or they also have their blister rust control areas where you need a permit to plant any currants or gooseberries. But that currently isn't the case in Minnesota. So you could plant some of these resistant varieties to blister rust if you're interested in planting those. So a little detail on the eradication of rabies. So one of the main efforts early on was to eliminate rabies. So early on, around 1912, they had the Plant Quarantine Act where they were limiting the importation of rabies as well as pines. But the main method from about 1917 to 1968 was to eradicate rabies. And this was quite a huge effort, as James went over. They spent $150 million, at least in those times. I mean, it's a lot more money now, but this work was carried out by full-time seasonal employees, and a lot of the civilian conservation crews that were established during the Great Depression did this work of hand pulling rabies plants, also applying herbicide. But over time, this was effective, especially in the eastern part of the United States, in limiting blister rust. But keeping this up was going to be quite a task. So overall, it wasn't feasible. In some of those areas, you had recolonization by currants and gooseberries. They were also finding spores being dispersed outside of the radius of where they were doing their eradication. So initially, they usually around white pine would establish a radius of eradication of about 100 meters. And incrementally, that kind of went up, even up to a mile. But those spores from the currants and gooseberries, they can go several kilometers, and they were kind of expanding outside of that radius of eradication. And also, as James noted, in addition to currants and gooseberries, you have other alternate hosts. Indian paintbrush or prairie fire, lousewort are also alternate hosts for blister rust. So that wasn't being eradicated at that time, and it was discovered later that those were alternate hosts for blister rust. But having said all that, if it does work, if you do find currants and gooseberries that are naturally growing in your woodlots around your house, you could remove them, but you probably don't want to put too much time and effort into it. If there are, fewer plants that are easy to locate, you could try to remove those to lower the amount of inoculum on your property. All right, so looking at where and how to plant white pine. So it's best to establish white pine under an existing overstory. So that's usually with about 40 to 50% crown closure. So white pine is a tree that has intermediate shade tolerance, so it can tolerate some shade. So looking at this image at the right, we have these different scenarios of, in A here, we have 25% canopy closure, B is 50%, and C is 75%. So this can be somewhat nebulous if you're in the woods trying to determine how much crown closure you have, but it gives you a rough idea. You would have to use a tool like a densiometer to actually get a percent measure of how much canopy crown closure you have. But kind of the sweet spot that's going to reduce blister rust infection is this 40 to 50% range. So the moisture isn't going to accumulate on those trees in the understory, and you still have enough sunlight that's going to promote growth of those white pine trees. So white pine can still grow when they're growing under 75% crown closure, but you're eliminating to some extent blister rust, but then you're sacrificing the growth of those white pine trees. So early on, white pine trees should grow about 15 inches per year. So if you're growing them, under more shade, you're going to sacrifice that, even though you're going to have less chance of blister rust infection. And you also want to try to grow white pine in higher densities, either if you're growing it under an existing overstory or if you're establishing a new planting of white pine. So you can do this 6 by 6 foot spacing or 7 by 8 foot spacing. So basically what this does is it kind of augments the pruning. They're going to self prune. And as James mentioned, white pine blister rust is an obligate biotroph, so it needs living tissue to survive. So a lot of those branches at the bottom of the trees are going to, naturally die, naturally prune. So you can eliminate infection that way since they don't have that living tissue to survive. And then once those trees get to about 20 to 24 feet in height, you'd probably want to go in there and do a pre-commercial thin to reduce the amount of competition for those trees. And also when you're looking at a new location to plant trees, again, based on the biology of this fungus, it needs those cool, moist conditions. So you don't want to plant it in depressions, those frost pockets, small canopy openings, north and west aspects, and the bases of slopes. So all these conditions are pretty conducive for the fungus to germinate and cause infection. And I also want to point out that using these management tactics are also very effective to manage white pine weevil. So white pine weevil is another problematic issue for establishing white pine. So if you're not familiar with that, it's a weevil that lays its eggs in the main terminal of a white pine tree, usually trees that are about 20 feet tall or less. And so it's not going to outright kill a tree, but it's, as you can see, it's going to kill the main terminal. So those eggs the weevils lay in the spring are going to become larvae, and they're going to feed in that main terminal. And what results is this characteristic shepherd's crook, and you're going to have a dead main terminal, and then a lateral branch is going to try to maintain apical dominance. And so what results is a crook in the tree. So that's going to, impact the aesthetics as well as the commercial value of that tree if you're growing it, for lumber or any other purpose. So growing it white pine under an overstory of about 40 to 50% crown closure, you're going to have more shade, which is an environment that's not very helpful for the white pine weevil, as it likes to feed on trees and in the open, in the sunlight. Also growing it in higher densities isn't as conducive for white pine weevil infestation, as you're going to promote faster growth. You're going to have smaller diameter main terminals, which are less attractive to the weevils. And you're also, when they're growing in closer stocking, you're going to have the white pine trees are going to have be able to more correct themselves if they do have any infestation from weevils. And just some final thoughts on management. So as it seems where most people are located, you're in the North Shore, so you're in a very high hazard zone. So James went over these maps, looking at Minnesota along the North Shore. You're in this zone where you're going to have conditions that are very conducive for blister rust infection with Lake Superior. So you're going to have to, if you're establishing white pine, do some control method. So pruning, looking at where you're planting your white pine trees, best to establish it under an existing overstory or plant them in high densities. If you're in a different zone, you might be able to get away without using some of those control methods like zone 1, where you could plant trees maybe more in the open or in a depression and you wouldn't have blister rust infection. But you just have to factor that in when you're establishing new white pine trees. And in addition to blister rust, you also want to think about other issues that can impact white pine. I mentioned white pine weevil, which can be very problematic for establishing white pine. Deer browse, so you might need to bud cap your new white pine trees that you have planted. Competing vegetation, which might outshade white pine trees. So there are a slew of different issues that can be difficult to manage for white pine trees, but in the end, it's worth it to establish white pine, as it is a pretty hardy species. It's compared to red pine, it's more resistant to things like drought and flooding. And also with a warming climate, it's predicted to fare better than species like red pine. So establishing white pine might take a bit of work, but in the end, it is worth it. All right, so just some of the resources that I went over in my talk. A lot of it is contained in some of these documents, which I can put in the chat. So the Minnesota DNR has this field tip sheet on pruning for blister rust. The Forest Service has a similar one for managing for blister rust and white pine weevil. However, this one doesn't seem to be as readily available online. James might have more info on accessing this one, and more details on how to prune trees, what pruning tools to use, different cuts is also available in this Forest Service publication. All right, and that's what I have for you.
Eric, thanks so much. I greatly appreciate this. I'm jotting notes left and right here. I'm almost running out of ink. So it's a good thing this thing is recorded, because I'm going to be going back to it. And I encourage all of you, once it's up on the CCHE website, Kelsey will let you know about when that might happen. You can always come back and review what you've seen here today. Mike Reichenbach, there's a lot here, these two presentations. Some initial thoughts to help get conversations started would be really helpful from you. And I noticed Jeff Jackson from University Extension is also on, and he's been throwing some stuff into the chat. So welcome as well, Jeff. And Mike, if you would.
Sure. What a great presentation, Eric and James. Really provided some good context. I took a couple of pages of notes, and I've worked with this a long time. Some of the things I picked up is that we've actually got a resistant species that can be purchased commercially. That's wonderful. Some of the other things that stood out in my mind are, this 40 to 50% shade. And so often what I try to do is I try to find a little gap in the canopy and put a tree there. And you guys said, no, that's probably not the best way to do it. And one of the reasons I think that's not the best way, at least my experience is I find that little gap on my property and I get the tree in there and then it just doesn't grow. And I go ahead and do the pruning to increase airflow. And because the forest around it is pretty dense, you're not getting much airflow anyway. And I prune too much and I'm up to 50% live crown, and then I'm only got 40% live crown, and pretty soon that tree just doesn't make it. So it's really helpful to hear those things. I'd be really interested to hear from the group though, as we're looking at planting typically fewer numbers of trees per acre to reestablish long-lived conifer in sites on the North Shore, what did you hear in this presentation that stood out to you?
I encourage you at this point, you could be unmuting yourself to chat, or you could put the information in the chat and I'll read it off for you.
Hey, this is Lowell Polachek. We have 3 acres on the North Shore, and I've planted I'm maintaining about 50 white pines and some other things. And I've done, like Mike said, try to plant them in gaps. But my question is, somewhere I thought somebody told me to keep the ground clear under the white pine in order to keep it drier. And I didn't hear anything about that today.
Yeah, that's another method. If you have a lot of ground vegetation, you're probably going to have a lot of moisture accumulating at the bases, of trees. And when you're doing that, I mean, you can also look for, currants and gooseberries if you're clearing vegetation. Because a lot of areas, where white pine grow, you're gonna probably naturally find ribes species too. But that is another method, if possible, to reduce the amount of ground vegetation as you're probably gonna have more moisture buildup.
Yeah, that's a common, I mean, Eric mentioned competition control with using herbicides or hand pulling other competing plants. That goes in that same vein. Removing that vegetation around, especially really young white pine, is essentially doing what he was talking about with that competition control. You're killing two birds with one stone. You're freeing that white pine to grow, and you're also decreasing its risk for white pine blister rust.
Yeah, and I think that second slide I had, it had a photo of a small white pine tree that was just engulfed in surrounding vegetation that had a blister rust infection. So that's kind of that conducive environment for blister rust to occur. And
It
I
looks
can
like
put
we have
my
a
slides in the chat maybe.
Yep, we have John wanted to unmute himself to say something. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I am wondering what can be done to maximize the propagation of the white pine from mature white pines. And I guess my question is the same for cedar trees. I don't find a lot of small trees, despite all the seeds that seem to be coming from the very mature white pines on my property. So is there something I could be doing to enhance that self-propagation?
Mike, do you want to start that one off?
Sure, John, thanks for that question. And I'd like to, and I think several folks on this call have been to Pat and Dan Billman's property up kind of between Duluth and Two Harbors. Pat and Dan Billman have been finding small white pine seedlings, but really only in an area that has been fenced off from deer. And they've been finding northern white cedar as well in those areas. So two things are happening there. One is there's a seed source, three things. There's a seed source for those seedlings. They did a lot of balsam fir removal. And if you remember at the beginning of this, I said what trees are kind of in the way and of planting new trees, and there it was balsam fir. So they removed the balsam fir, and in doing so, they exposed a lot of bare mineral soil. So you've got seed, you've got bare mineral soil, and you've got a exclosure to keep the deer off. And in those areas, they're seeing white pine and northern white cedar. So John, I guess my question for you do you have exclosures, and do you have a little bit of bare mineral soil around for the seed to catch?
No exclosures, and maybe that's the secret. Different years there's a different amount of bareness up there. This last year it was really pretty wild.
Right. So yeah. So anybody else with experience with that? I know there's some other landowners I recognize on here that may have had some experience in finding white pine. And where are you finding the seedlings?
Steve Sandy, if I can chat for a second.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have property out by the Cadence, about 9 miles east of Grand Marais. And I've lived here I've been a Cook County resident all my life, but I've lived out here for about 40 years. And I have about 10 acres, and I've kind of expanded my planting into some of the state property. I border the Cadence State Park, and I have forestry land behind me. And I probably planted about 1,000 white pine over these 40 years. then I probably planted about the same amount of red pine and quite a few cedar. I kind of found I have a lot of gooseberry down by the lake. And so I experienced a lot of blister rust, but I kind of find that probably, maybe less than 10%, maybe about 5% of my white pine seem, and I planted blister, they were supposedly, blister rust resistant trees. But over the years, they probably, I get about 5% that probably have survived. And I've done a lot of pruning of branches. And as I get further away from the lake, I find the percentage of white pine that survive goes up to almost 50%, if not higher. Once I get away from, just like everyone was saying, the damp conditions of Lake Superior are not very conducive. The other thing I have found is over the years, I started with cards, and I'll clip over the terminal buds a card. But then I also found that's more effective is I'll spray that with a deer and rabbit repellent too. And I have several neighbors that feed the deer, so I have a high deer population too, which is rugged on both the white pine and the red pine. But I find as I spray those trees, the deer around the area start to determine that they are not a great species to eat. And they stay away from them more as, I spray them, they probably take and nibble on them and don't like them as well. And the same with the cedar. I've planted a lot of white cedar, but those are probably the hardest to keep the deer away from. But in order to really propagate my white cedar, I find I have to fence them. But I've tried a lot of experiments that haven't, I've had a couple trees that have had blister rust, and it's gotten into the stem of the tree. And I've actually taken a few of those younger trees and stripped off the bark in that area. And I've taken a little butane torch. I've been just experimenting and burnt that area. And I've had a few of those that have come back from the blister rust. So I've been just kind of experimenting just to see what, if I just some bizarre things just to see if they work or not. But anyhow, I just wanted to relay that information.
Well, it's very helpful. Thank you. We have some other people that have been tossing out some suggestions too. So if you haven't been checking out the chat, please do so. Somebody's mentioned deep pine needle duff seems to discourage seedlings under my big trees in the Twin Cities. They also, another person mentioned that they wanted to know if they're planting white pine seedlings in any area where the older dying birch trees are providing the crown closure. Is that a good idea? Any comments from those that are listening?
Well, I think- Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, John.
No, I was
um,
just simply going to say, in those areas where the birch are dying, we don't have a forest. We need to start somewhere.
True story. Anything can serve as that canopy cover for eastern white pine. It doesn't have to be eastern white pine. Many of our red pine plantations will actually put a red pine under, or a white pine, excuse me, a white pine understory underneath that red pine overstory, it serves the same purpose. So any species you can get that's going to provide that kind of crown closure, and not necessarily crown closure, but that crown coverage is going to be beneficial. One thing I'll add with establishing seedlings, that the best seed bed for eastern white pine is bare mineral soil. You have a good seed year, you go in and harvest a mature overstory white pine stand. There's parts of the United States, certainly in Minnesota as well, where you'll have thousands of seedlings per acre. And so, because you're exposing that bare mineral soil. And you could do that by hand, by hand raking and removing brush and competing vegetation and whatnot. But that equipment damage in quotes underneath a harvested stand really does produce that bare mineral soil in a good seed bed.
Yeah, James, this is Mike. And that's exactly what, when we're working with landowners here to encourage them to do. So as you're looking at, you've got a seed source. If you can create exclosures and then create that bare mineral soil, in most cases, I would say almost in all cases, you're going to be able to capture white pine.
There was also some concerns mentioned about thimbleberry. Any comments about that?
I put that one in chat. Thimbleberry is a rubus species, I think. I don't know, was I still on direct message to you, Kelsey? I might have been. I don't.
You're great. Nope, you were good. Some people
Okay.
are not great about reading the chat. So if you could just repeat it for those that might have missed
no
it.
problem. So thimbleberry, although the leaves can look a little bit like ribes, which might be where the concern came from, which is a good catch. Those leaves do kind of look like ribes a little bit. It's a rubus species, and I forget the species name, so forgive me for the native thimbleberry. But that's not a host for white pine blister rust. So nothing to worry about.
Awesome, thank you. And then we also had some people wanting to know about where to purchase the Patton variety of white pine, and there was a suggestion of a nursery and a website put in the chat. So if you want to check that out, please. And then I want to go down to another question that was asked on here about I have a white pine tree and it has thrown seeds, and I've produced 4 other trees on my 5 acres. The question is, the newest tree next to it is a big white pine. Do I try and replant it?
Anytime I get questions like that, I always say, go for it. What's the harm that could happen? You got a big mature white pine sitting there. As I mentioned, there's some resistance around, and I guess I hate using the term resistance because to some folks, resistance implies this thing's not going to get sick. And that's immune. And that particular white pine that Eric mentioned and has been in the chat a little bit, this Patton Silver Splendor. Patton Silver Splendor is not immune to white pine blister rust. And Eric alluded to it a little bit. You still should be practicing the good stewardship of white pine, planting of white pine. You should be avoiding high hazard, low valleys, places with a lot of dew. You should still be pruning it if you want it to survive long term. And so it can still get sick. One of the things about pruning and letting trees get large that I'll say too is some people think they prune white pines and they're not going to get blister rust. That's not the case either. The idea is that you get the trees large enough so that if it does get a canker in the upper stem, and let's say you've got a 60-foot eastern white pine and it gets a canker 50 feet in the air. What happens is it just kills the top of the tree. You still have a tree standing there. You're also providing some other wildlife benefits with that dead top, woodpeckers, things of that nature. So you still have the tree. It's getting those white pine to the point where they're going to be trees. That's the goal of pruning and site selection. So.
Okay, can I ask you a couple questions?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know if anybody's been to the Knife River Community Forest. It's on the Shilhon Road off of the expressway between Duluth and Two Harbors, but it had been logged, and after that it was planted to white pine on a 10 by 10 spacing, I think. And since then, the community, that was about 7-10 years ago or something. And since then, the community's been involved in bud capping and caging. And so now the trees, so the question, so anyhow, and there's hiking trails in there, so you can go and see what's all been done. There's also a lot of young white pine coming up. However, there is no canopy whatsoever because they had logged the area. So I hope that the white pines survive. I'm a little concerned hearing what you said. And also, so we've been starting to remove the cages because some of the trees are over 10 feet, but you said to prune. I guess we can't start pruning yet because we'd just prune off the very bottom branches then is all, and we want to leave 2/3. So that's the first question. Well, the first thing is if anybody wants to go hiking and see what's been done there, it's quite impressive. With what's happening, and cedar have been planted also. So that's the first thing is Knife River Community Forest hiking trails off the Shilhon Road, off the expressway between Duluth and Two Harbors. So the question is pruning, at what point do you start pruning? How tall do the trees have to be? And then also the second question is, have you been following Julie Ederson and the whole forest migration, the farmers assisting the forest migration program that's going on up here with David Abaz, and a bunch of us farmers are trying to grow white pines, and yeah, so you've been following. Okay, so anyhow,
Yep.
if you, just about that, if you want to, yeah. Speak about
Let
that.
me just speak to the last question there. David Abaz is actually on our North Shore Forest Collaborative Executive Committee. So very much tied into his projects and his efforts to work on assisted migration of species to our region. So, but I'll let the other experts speak on behalf of the pruning at young ages, and if that's okay to do that.
Hey, John, if you have any further information about that assisted migration, would you mind tossing it in the chat so people could follow along? Because some
Sure.
people may not have as much knowledge about that as others.
Will do. Maybe Jeff Jackson, if you're still there, you might find it faster than me.
Yes, I was. Thanks, John. I'll drop it in within a few seconds. I just met with David this week too, so I'll
Great.
share some information there. Thanks.
Sounds good. You bet. So
I
on
also
the
just want to
topic,
shout out that there is one of our previous presentations. He talks at length about it. So if you go look at our recordings, you might find some of his presentation on it previously.
Sherry, one of the things, this is Mike, I'd like to know is, and maybe I can just look it up, but the Knife River Community Forest and the hiking trails, I'd like to go there and I'd like to see the forest. I'm super excited that you're involved with the kind of the assisted migration stuff. It sounds like maybe you'll be working with David Abaz and possibly growing some seedlings, and that's really good news.
Well, just if I can interrupt just for a second, it's a farmer assisted. And so I'm a blueberry farmer. And so many of us are farmers and are trying to bring our expertise in farming, and it doesn't necessarily translate very well to growing trees, but we're learning. We're very dedicated, and this is where David Abaz is just encouraging us all to know now. So
Super excited to have you on and hear you're involved with that.
yes, and go to the hiking trails. It's really something to see out there. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to say, it was Mr. Sandy who spoke there. Yeah, the planting that you've done, and what really stuck with me about your comments was the observations you've made about where the trees get are less affected by the blister rust based on as you go up that hill and away from the lakeshore, and the things that you found that you go ahead and do the bud capping, and then you go ahead and put a rabbit or deer repellent on that, and you might not get every tree, but you're seeing that it tends to discourage the deer from taking all the trees. So I think some really good observations. Thank you.
One other thing I just wanted to bring up with, I know we have someone from the DNR and the forestry, but I've been kind of thinking as I've been planting, because I've kind of run out of areas on my property to plant, and so I've kind of expanded. But I know, like by the Cadence, the DNR has been planting white pine and cedar. And I think there's a lot of people in the county, in this area, that probably really appreciate, you know, some of these plantings and trees. And I was thinking, it's real hard for the forestry and the DNR to manage these trees after they plant them. So they have them caged, a lot of them. And when I take a walk, a lot of times I'll pull weeds out from around them, so that kind of exposes them a little bit more. But I was thinking, if a program was developed where you had people that could adopt, say, like 10 trees, you know, like in the Cadence State Park or Cascade State Park, and however many trees they wanted to tend to. And then once they're planted, I would just like to, you know, get some input, you know, from the DNR, if that would be something they'd ever be interested in doing, you know, trying to get some of the public involved. So I'll just leave that, you know, for comments.
Thank you, Steve. I'll leave that to the DNR Forest Service to work on that
Yeah.
subject. I love the creativity, though. I mean, that's you know, a lot of good things can happen when a community comes together. There was, I think, an outstanding question from Sherry yet on the pruning of young trees. If you know, Eric, maybe you want to deal with that one.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, as I mentioned in my talk, you could start pruning, you know, as when those trees get to about 2 feet tall or 5 to 7 years old. But if you have a lot of trees, you know, you don't have a lot of people that can do that pruning, you might have to selectively do that pruning where you know, select the best looking trees, the ones that look the most vigorous. I know there was in an older publication where, based on how much infection you're getting, if you do a walk around in your stand, based on how many trees per acre you have, you can have an acceptable infection rate. I don't know if this is an old Forest Service publication. I don't know if James knows more about that one. But yeah, those are kind of the main methods. So it might be overwhelming if you have a huge, you know, pine plantation to prune every single tree, but so you might have to selectively do it. And
Great.
you probably want to do that, you know, again, maintaining that 2/3, you know, live crown. So it could be every few years, or depending on that ratio of what that live crown is.
Great,
Great.
thanks a lot.
Thank you. Just a comment. I thought this was maybe a good point for me to mention that over the past 2 years, North Shore Forest Collaborative has been able to distribute white pine seedlings. They're very robust seedling plug provided by through Minnesota Power, who has donated them to distribute to those people on the North Shore. And we were approved once again to receive this donation of about 40,000 white pine seedlings this spring. They are a great tree. They're not the variety that we've been talking about tonight, but from what I'm hearing is that it gives the trees a good chance of sprouting quickly and moving on towards becoming full-size trees. But I'm guessing blister rust, regardless, is going to be an issue with those seedlings as well. So again, follow Eric's and James's recommendations here, and Mike's as well. I think that's wise. But again, looks like about 40,000 seedlings will be distributing this coming spring, which is good news. And I also saw that Steve Weeks was on here. Steve is with the Weeks Family Foundation, and they have for almost getting close to 10 years now, have been providing discount fencing for you folks to protect your trees on the North Shore, which we definitely need, because bud capping doesn't seem to do the trick But anyways, I just want to mention that for those who are curious if seedlings are coming again. Certainly there's other outlets we anticipate, whether that's forgetting the name now, up the Gunflint Trail, Headstrom, excuse me.
That's just the lumber, yeah.
And as well as guessing Castle Danger will probably have seedlings again. So anyways, I
I
don't
would also
want to
say,
disrupt.
if you're in Cook County, pay attention to the Cook County Community Center too, because their extension program sometimes has some information about seedlings.
Great.
Was it Sherry, the blueberry farmer? Was that that person's name, Sherry?
Yes.
So she mentioned something that kind of caught my ear a little bit, that about, hoping that the trees will survive. And that is something we run into talking about blister rust and all sorts of diseases. Blister rust is not a wildfire. White-tailed deer are by far more destructive to eastern white pine than blister rust is, especially at those younger ages. And so when I was going over the life cycle, one thing I probably didn't hit on enough is that those environmental conditions that get that spore to germinate and go into the needle, not all spores are going to germinate and go into the needle. Not all infections that start in the needle are even going to make it to the branch. And not all infections that get into a branch are going to make it into the main stem and be a lethal canker. So you have all of these spots where increases in disease are actually stopped. And blister rust is a really good example of this because of the really complex life cycle. So you could have various environmental conditions throughout the entire year, since you have this big, huge life cycle, that get interrupted by something. And that decreases the amount of disease you have. And so what we end up with blister rust is, some people call them wave years, where we have the right environmental conditions all throughout the growing season in the summer and in the fall. And in that following spring and in years past, you'll see just this increase in the number of cankers that you're seeing. And they're all roughly the same age. And so that was because of a wave year that had occurred years previous, where you might not have conducive environmental conditions for 2, 3, 4, 5 years on your property, and you won't get any new infections. So that's something to consider. It's the chances that blister rust is going to take out that whole developing stand are near zero. So I encourage you to pay attention to that stand as you're going on hiking. And if you see a blister rust infection, like Eric said, you can carry a pruning shears with you when you're out hiking and just clip that branch off. You just stop blister rust from getting to the main stem of that tree. So, Johnny or Jane pruning shear seed or whatever, walking around hiking in blister rust areas. So.
That's good to know. We have that power in our hands right there. I just want to let everybody know that we will be ending at 7, which gives us we have about 8 minutes too. I left my email address in the chat. If you can't get your question in here in the next 5 to 6 minutes, feel free to send me an email and I'll if I don't have the answer, I'll find it for you and get the right person out to you. So maybe a couple more questions, Kelsey, before we begin our wrap up.
I think we're pretty clean in our chat, but it looks like John has his hand up to, if you want to unmute, and go ahead.
Yeah, well, this might be out of bounds, but I'm just still recovering from the spruce budworm. And so we got other trees, in addition to the white pine. So what's the forecast for that kind of stuff, or is that a whole different session?
I think that's a good one for another session, John.
Yeah, snow signs of slowing down. This year each year we do a aerial survey. We mapped 500,000 acres of damage from spruce budworm, most of it being in Lake and Cook County. Historically, it's not out of the ordinary. I think in the mid-90s, we had about a similar number of 500,000 acres. But it's probably just the overabundance of balsam fir in the landscape, having less, wildland fire. And it's called spruce budworm, but the main host is balsam fir. And that's something with the DNR and I'm sure the Forest Service is, having difficulties manage, just doing a lot of, pre-salvage cleanup if you can. There's poor markets for balsam fir, and I know a lot of landowners are doing cleanup. The DNR has, stewardship grants. I know USDA has EQIP grants that landowners have used to clean up a lot of dead and dying trees from spruce budworm. But it's probably, going to be in Cook County for, another 8 and 10 years still, until it kind of runs through its cycle, and then it'll be back in another 30 to 40 years. It was in Cook County probably in the early mid-90s the last time, and now it's, back again.
Whoa, how is it the mid-90s that long ago? That's the first.
Eric, if I may jump in here, Eric, I'm glad you said that balsam fir is something we probably have too much of. And if you go back to one of my comments at the very beginning, I said, what trees do we have too many of? Where are we going to get the space to plant these white pine and stuff? And so as we're going through, John, you mentioned, you're dealing with spruce budworm, and as folks like, that I mentioned already, that have white pine and cedar coming up after cleaning up from spruce budworm, it creates some opportunities for us going into the future. And I think, John, my final comment here, because we're close to concluding, is someone else in the chat did talk about how they go around and kind of, they didn't say adopt trees, but they go and they see fencing on DNR land that might be falling down, and they kind of, and this is probably on the parks, go ahead and repair that. And I look at that and I thought immediately, and John, this is beyond what we're talking about here, but I'm just going to say the neighbor to neighbor program. It sounds like there's an opportunity here. So I really thank those two people for those comments. Thank you.
I think that was Steve Sandy who came up with that thought. So thank you. So with that, I just want to give you just a quick notice for those who are on our email blast list that we send out. I'll probably send out a email probably after the first of the year, letting you know that we'll have a new website to look at. And we hope that we'll be able to streamline your access to the resources you're looking for to help revitalize our North Shore landscape. So look for that as well. Another big thing that's coming down the pike here is we were approved to proceed with a large grant from the LCCMR, and that's for outreach forestry to private landowners on the North Shore. So if the legislature approves that this spring in this next session, look for a lot more information about outreach forestry and coming out to your properties and helping develop small little what we call woods walk plans for you on your properties. So again, two big things coming up, and just cross your fingers on that big grant. So that'd be really great. So anyways, thank you so much. I know Kelsey is here to wrap things up from CCHE, and thank you again, Kelsey. This has been great, and we'll be definitely doing this again in the future.
We're always happy to work with you every time. It's such a joy. I learned so much, and I know that there'll be lots of people watching this recording because I know you're all going to share with people. I can already tell. So I want to thank Eric and James and John for coming together tonight to answer so many questions and give us new information that maybe we didn't have before, or refine information that we already had. If you have something that came out of this that you want more information, I know John, as he said, is happy to help do some more, as well as us at Cook County Higher Ed. So if there's something we can be offering that helps support your learning or improves some sort of education opportunity, please let us know. I do know we're still getting some questions in the chat. So if anybody wants to toss any answers out at those individuals last minute, or if you want to stay a minute or two longer, I'll let you do that. But I know that Eric and James and John might have Friday night plans, and so we want to let them go on to their day. So I'll give you a minute or two and then go on. Thank you so much, you guys. Did a great job.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Kelsey. This was awesome.
Always
you.
a joy.
Yeah, thanks,
Thanks,
Kelsey.
John.
It looks like one of the last questions we didn't get was my MPL seedlings grow 10 to 15 per year. However, the natural seeded whites only grow 1 to 2 per year. Why are they slower? Any answers to that person? I think that's the last one we didn't miss.
That's not uncommon for seedlings grown in a setting where they're bombarded with fertilizer for the first X number of years of their life, and they come with a ready-made plug of nutrients when you plant them in the ground. Those naturally germinated seedlings will generally catch up. It just takes a few years for them to get their feet about them. But those plugs that you get, I assume they're grown in a styrofoam plug or an individual plug, John. Those
Yep.
Minnesota Power and whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, that chunk of soilless mix that has a bunch of fertilizer in it already is giving that tree a big head start. And that's something when the seed germinates on its own in mineral soil, it just doesn't have. So, but
That's
they'll catch
awesome.
them.
Thank you. Any last questions? Otherwise, we would say good night and happy holidays.
All right. Same to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.